Okay, my friends, so from here I will be talking about spoilers and about specific points about this film. So once again, if you have not seen this film, please turn off this video because I do not want to spoil this film for you. This is a film that I think one should watch spoiler-free. Let it let it just run and let it just soak in its brilliance, and don't let any spoiler ruin the fun. So with that in mind, my friends, if you have not seen this film, once again I strongly urge you to turn off this video and watch the film, and you can always come back and return to this video, and then at that point, my friends, you and I might be able to talk about this film. Okay, so you're still here, so that means that you're okay talking about this film. Okay, so what can we say about this film, EE? As I say before, I think it is a film that, on the one hand, is a film that, relatively speaking, at least compared to some of the other films in Edward Yang's canon, this is a film that I think is fairly easy to get into, on the one hand. And the reason why I say that is because I think, unlike some of Edward Yang's other films, this film, EE, presents its main characters in a way that almost immediately are very easy to understand. In other words, we are dealing more or less with a core family, the Jian family. And we have the father and mother, NJ and Minmin, and we have the daughter and the little son, Ting Ting and Yang Yang, and then we have the grandmother, and then we have the mother's brother, or NJ's brother-in-law, Adi, and we have Adi's new wife, Xiaoyan, and we have also a little one who is expected, who is on the way, who is going to be born later in the film, of course. What's his name? We don't know. So, then we have also on the periphery, but no less important or no less significant, we have other characters that are not necessarily part of the family, but still serve a very significant role in the fabric of the world of EE. So we have the neighbors of the Jian family. So we have Lily and her mother, and a certain romantic entanglements that are involved not only with the mother but also with the daughter, and in particular the daughter's boyfriend Fatih. Then we have the story of NJ and his company and the people that he works with in the company, and a certain malaise that sets in with NJ and his outlook on the company and also the outlook on his life. And this is played out in the context of the specific story that is regarding the Japanese Mr. Ota, and that forms yet another interesting side plot to this world of EE. Also with NJ, it's not a familial connection, but there is also the former girlfriend, the former lover of NJ from many years back, Sherry. And she re-enters his life in a very surprising way, but it reignites or rekindles certain feelings or perhaps memories or rumors of something of the past, and it also recalls or reminds NJ of something of the past. And it also forces both him and her to re-invoke the past, to revisit the past, to look back on the past happiness, at the happy moments of the past and also those not so happy moments, and to confront the truths, the real hard truths about why certain things happened the way they did in the context of their relationship. Why did their relationship not work out the way that they perhaps might have wanted it to? And it's a really sad tale. But that yet forms yet another character grouping, if you will. And then there is also Adi and his little story, not only with his wife and the certain hijinks that ensue in terms of his own financial situation, which is a bit of a mess. Adi is a little bit of a buffoon, and he, in many ways, I think is played for perhaps a little bit of laughs, although there is a certain tragic bent that is layered on into his story. There's also the story of him and a former flame, Union, and the kind of trouble that Union starts with respect in particular to the new wife of Adi, who is Xiao Yan. And yes, so there we have it. And we have this tableau of characters, which I think on the one hand there are many characters, so it might seem, on paper at least, that it might seem a little bit difficult to follow. But I would argue that actually on the contrary, the way in which these characters are presented, namely primarily in this family dynamic, I think is the primary reason why this film is very accessible, even upon a first-time watch. Because we are seeing these characters that are on the one hand disparate, but on the other hand certainly connected in terms of this web of interconnectivity, which of course we've seen in other past Edward Yang films. But what makes this film different from other Edward Yang films is that they are presented in this family dynamic, this rubric, this way in which I think we can easily access the world, right? I mean, I think in other words, we can understand the father-mother dynamic. We can understand the fact that there are children, the daughter and the son, and then the grandmother and the story there, and then the brother-in-law and the story there, and the characters are, I think, very very clearly delineated in terms of the company, NJ's company, also NJ's former lover, and also the little child, Yang Yang, and also his little story with school and his own self-discovery. Then there's Ting Ting, and also her story with the neighbors, and Lily and Fatty, and also the grandmother. And also there's Adi and Xiaoyan and Yun Yun, and Min Min as well, the mother. So I think the characters, although they are very plentiful, they're all delineated in a very clear structure that makes for ease of accessibility. And thus I think we are given something that is at once easily accessible. But once we access the world, we are left exposed to its complexities and the way in which there are certain intricacies and nuances that are layered on in a way that is so Edward Yang, which is what we've seen before, namely the way in which this interconnectivity is tuned precisely, the way in which certain plot narrative devices are set up, the way in which different forms of modes of interconnectivity are shown. Either they're explicit or implied. Most of the time when they're implied, that means that it is left to us, the viewer, to try to fit the pieces into place. How do these characters concretely, specifically connect with one another? We are left to wonder precisely what their past relationships were. So there are many sort of elliptical forms of ways of presenting information. So on the one hand, it is a very easily accessible film, relatively speaking. But on the other hand, once we enter its world, I think we are left to wonder and to marvel at the true richness and complexity of, again, the interconnectivity among these characters, which is so wonderfully typical of Edward Yang's films, as we've seen in films past, starting from That Day on the Beach, continuing all the way through to Type A Story, certainly with The Terrorizer, certainly with A Brighter Summer Day, Confusion, Mahjong. So there you have it in terms of a kind of a general structure, if you will. Going into the particular pockets of character arcs that we see, I think we are also left to explore the way in which Edward Yang delves into many themes that we have seen him explore in many films of the past. And we see this in the way in which he develops his character arcs. So what do I mean by this? So for example, let's take a character of NJ and his particular story. He is a family man, but he is also a businessman, and he is undergoing, I would say, a certain set of crises, not just one crisis, but a certain set of crises having to do with not only his emotional well-being, but also his economic well-being as well. His emotional well-being is, of course, affected by, primarily so, by his reunion with his former flame, his past lover, girlfriend, which is quite a meeting that was very accidental in terms of how they met in the elevator at the wedding, the hotel of the wedding. So it was purely by chance, but it then sparks certain feelings and emotions that erupt forth and that lead to a particular arc in the film that leads to his emotional exploration of his own character. That's one aspect of his character. The other aspect of his character that is explored is, of course, him as a businessman and the sort of crisis that he undergoes because, on the one hand, his company wants to engage with a certain Japanese software mogul, I suppose, a businessman whose name is Mr. Ota. But on the other hand, the company is also considering going with a lesser known, a mere copycat of Mr. Ota, a shadow, if you will, of Mr. Ota, a fake, if you will. So there is a kind of lack of integrity that NJ feels if the company goes that copycat route, because in particular he feels a strong connection with Mr. Ota, this Japanese businessman, because the Japanese businessman seems to express certain aspects not only of business but also certain aspects of humanity that really appeal to him and to us as well as the viewer. I cannot deny the fact that Mr. Ota is one of the most magical characters in all of Edward Yang's cinema. The way in which he appears and disappears, the impression that he leaves is truly remarkable and unforgettable. So it's no wonder that NJ feels this close connection with Mr. Ota in a way that is ultimately betrayed, not by NJ directly, of course, but by the decisions that are made by the company, which leaves, of course, NJ feeling very dissatisfied and perhaps betrayed and perhaps exhausted and disappointed with the life. So these two themes, as portrayed within the character of NJ, are very key because they exemplify, I think, a theme that we've seen played out in past Edward Yang films, namely this idea of urban living and the notion of modern urban living, and specifically in the context of two seemingly irreconcilable concepts, namely, on the one hand, economic prosperity, or the pursuit of economic prosperity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the notion of being emotionally satisfied, being happy. Is it possible to be happy and have economic prosperity at the same time? I would argue that in past Edward Yang films, his thesis with respect to that hypothesis, or how should I put it, his hypothesis with respect to that particular thesis is that they are irreconcilable. And we've seen this time and time again with particular characters that we've seen expressed in past Edward Yang films. Here, I think we also see it played out, but in an interesting way, I would say. And it's like this. The dichotomy that's painted here, I think, is made much more complex and much more richly complex by the fact that with respect to his interactions with the Ota character, what's really fascinating there is that the business side of things, I think up to now in an Edward Yang film, hasn't necessarily been expressed in a way such that we see here in EE. In other words, NJ and Mr. Ota, the Japanese businessman, seem to have a real connection. And the connection is based not separate from the business world. On the contrary, it's made right smack dab in the middle of this business deal. In other words, the business deal that he wants to strike between his company and Mr. Ota is in itself an expression of the kind of human connection that he wants to make with Mr. Ota, or that he feels that he has already made with Mr. Ota. This is remarkable to me because it fuses the notion of economic prosperity as expressed in the idea of closing the deal, of reaching a deal with Mr. Ota. It fuses that idea with the notion of making a connection with another human being. I think up to now, I don't know if we've seen this fusion between these two poles expressed in this way before. In other words, I think they've always been maybe separate or maybe at odds with each other. Here, they seem, on the contrary, to be not at odds with each other, but rather complementary to each other in a way that is so magical. And again, it's lifted up by the fact that the Ota character is one of the most sincerely earnest characters I've ever seen in an Edward Yang film. Truly magical. And so that's really remarkable to me, that we see this expression of business and ways of doing business and honoring promises, or honoring a gentleman's way of doing business. And this is, by definition, at least in this film, a way of honoring a certain human connection that NJ feels that he has made with this truly remarkable man. Incidentally, the scenes with Ota, I think, are really just astounding. The way they connect over the Bellini music in the car. It's, I think, Ota says, what is it, the great Renata, whereas in fact I understand that according to the commentary, Edward Yang says it's actually Kylie Peng and another opera singer, but they're supposed to suggest the great Renata, but it's in fact not the great Renata, but it's a special recording that I think was made especially for the film. But that's beside the point. I think the fact that they connect over music is really quite powerful, and the scene that follows after that, where they're at the karaoke bar and he is shown singing the Japanese song Ue o Muite Aruko. What's the English title? Sukiyaki, I think it is. But the Japanese title Ue o Muite Aruko essentially means stay positive and look on the bright side. So he expresses a certain kind of positiveness and a certain positive nature, and that shows also in his just his respect for things around him and the beauty around him, the way he expresses himself when he's playing the Moonlight Sonata, the way he says, why are we afraid of new things? Every day is a new day. We wake up and it's a new day. So he expresses a certain philosophy of life. And of course, that great magical scene that he has where NJ and he meet in the Japanese restaurant, and he's doing his card trick. And he says, I'm not a magician. I'm just a man. I just focus on things. But that's what he has to offer. He offers his humanity to NJ and his company, which is one of those great expressions of humanity. He's not a magician. He is just someone who just tries through the strength of his will to achieve a certain result. And that certain result is in the sphere of positivity and positiveness. That ultimately is betrayed by the ultimate decision that is made by NJ's company, of course. But this is, again, an example of this fusion of these two seemingly irreconcilable poles, at least as we've seen in other Edward Yang's work, I would argue, which I think is what makes EE at once a wonderful, let's say, development or evolution in Edward Yang's thematic exploration of this particular theme of economic prosperity and emotional happiness. And up to now, ne'er the two shall meet. But except here, I think they have met in a certain interesting way. Of course, the narrative doesn't necessarily play out that way, but for a certain moment there, at least, there is a union there that is truly beautiful. With respect to the urban living, what I would say also is, just entering into this, we have urban landscapes that invade, that populate, that just highlight the mise-en-scène of this film. They certainly do in the context of NJ's story. They do with other characters, but let's take NJ's story as an example. Specifically, we see moments where NJ is seen in the distance with a particular character. For example, in Japan, they are walking through the city. They are together. They are in train stations. They are riding on a train. They are maybe taking a visit outside of Tokyo to a shrine somewhere, within the landscape of nature. So on the one hand, they are shown also in Taipei as well. They're also shown in, seaside resort in outside of Tokyo in Japan. But they're also shown in the context of the urban landscape. NJ as well, not just with his storyline of Shelley, but also with his storyline of the business and also with the family. He is shown within the skyline and the cityscape of Taipei itself. And in many times when we see him in rooms where he is shown with the reflection of glass superimposed upon his image. Therefore, we see his figure superimposed upon which is the landscape of Taiwan or Taipei or Japan. That is superimposed in an image that is either in sort of lovely a parallel continuity or harmony with his image, or it goes against his image. And I think that's also exemplified in the way in which shots of distancing and the way in which the city is exposed. In some of those shots, I feel like he is in harmony with the city, and in other times I feel like he is in discord with the city. And I think that has a lot to do with his emotional state of mind. Whenever we see him and he has a certain emotional calmness in his particular state, for instance, maybe he is particularly happy in a particular moment, there's a certain sense of harmony with himself and his surroundings. But whenever there is a moment of discord in his particular storyline, then I think we sense, again, a discord with himself and his surroundings. What do I mean by this? So, for example, there's a wonderful moment where he's walking in the seaside resort, or the coastal resort, or a coastal city outside of Tokyo, and they stay in that hotel. And he's walking and he says to a passerby, "Ohayo," which I think might be an oblique reference to Ozu. But he says Ohio, and he's walking, and there's a lovely way in which his figure, as they're walking along the street, runs in lovely parallel with the street and the coastal line. So there's a lovely sense of harmony that's formed by the geographical landscape and the way in which the characters travel through that geography. And indeed, that is, I think, arguably speaking, a moment of happiness, because the two of them are walking and they're together, and they're together after being apart for a very long time. And so I think he is at that moment feeling a certain sense of happiness. And thus there is an emotional harmony, and thus a kind of harmony with the environment, shall we say. But then there are other moments where there is a certain discord. For instance, not soon after that scene, we see the two of them have a very intense scene in the hotel room, followed by a scene where he is alone on a kind of, I think, pier or an extension that leads to the sea or to the ocean, and he is there alone, kneeling down, smoking a cigarette, and we see him shot in it from a distance, and the waves are kind of crashing around him. And that crash, I think, is so emblematic and so symbolic of a kind of discord, the crash that he has with the environment around him, and that falls so spot on, I think, with the, let's say, the emotional, almost chaotic state of mind that I can only imagine his character is in, because that scene immediately follows the incredibly intense moment that he shared in the hotel room just moments before that scene. And so that's, I think, an example of a kind of emotional discord that is linked with an environmental discord that we see shown visually in terms of visual terms, and the way in which his character seems to be in a lack of harmony with the surroundings that he finds himself in, that is literally expressed by the crashing of waves around him. Another thing that I think is wonderful about the way in which cityscapes are used in the context of NJ's story is, let's take an example. Outside of Tokyo, I think visiting a shrine. It's a very picturesque place. It's a lovely time, and it's nature. There's lots of natural surroundings, foliage, and it's a beautiful sort of architectural place. So it feels very natural, and it's really refreshing because up to then we've basically been in the city, Taipei as well, which I think for all its beauty and all its worth, there is still much a kind of pressure cooker feel, almost claustrophobic feel, because of the buildings and the high rises and everything that the city has to offer, both good and bad, the sort of the urban life, if you will. So to break away from that in the Japan scenes, where the two of them go off on their little day excursion, I think is really, on the one hand, quite refreshing, because we're stepping out of that urban environment into a more natural setting, if you will. So I would think that Edward Yang would take the opportunity with that particular moment to make some kind of comment about urban malaise or the ennui of modern living, or something to that effect. It's better for the spirit to live in nature, or something like that. I would have expected Edward Yang perhaps to go that route in the context of NJ's storyline vis-a-vis Shelley. I would have expected that. And I really thought that when I first saw the film, but I think what happens, here is that he does something which is quite remarkable, which is that he has the storyline between NJ and Sherry play out in such emotionally turbulent terms. In other words, this is the moment where we get the precise reason why NJ essentially broke up with Sherry in the first place. So this is, I think, a very emotionally troubling scene. The fact that it's played out in this otherwise beautiful natural setting is so discordant on the one hand and so surprising on the other, that I find the scene to be utterly remarkable. The fact that he takes this moment, which should be in many ways quite liberating because of the naturalness of the setting, but he uses it to express the most almost emotional volatility between the characters. And in fact, this is the most angry that we have ever seen NJ. He says, how could you have betrayed me with your expectations? I didn't want to be an engineer or something, but you, of all people, forced that expectation upon me. Can't you understand how disappointed that made me feel, or something to that effect? Is truly just startling in its unexpectedness. And therefore, it seems to suggest that the sort of urban malaise or ennui that might have been played out in a way to suggest that it's because of the urban landscape that the people are the way they are, and the emotional lack of satisfaction that they have is because of, for whatever reason, the urban landscape. No, what this scene shows is in fact quite the opposite. It is not the urban landscape that leads to this, but perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps it is the human condition that was like that all along, regardless of whether people are in their urban environment or whether they are in a more natural environment. They will still be the way they are. NJ will still feel the way he does feel. So this is, to me, a really remarkable comment and a truly almost striking development in the exploration of this notion of urban malaise that I think we've seen play out from Edward Yang's earliest films, from That Day on the Beach and Taipei Story up to now. But this scene, I think, turns it almost on its head in a brilliant way. I should also add that there's something remarkable about the way in which the scene which the two of them, Sherry and NJ, they are shot. Remember that scene when they're shot going up those stone steps, and it's shot from a distance. this scene is so, on the one hand, they're shot from very far, so we are not intruding upon them. So on the one hand, it might seem like we are separate from them. But on the other hand, that separateness almost makes the scene so intimate. In other words, the fact that we are so distant from them means that we are so intimate with them as well. And what do I mean by this? Edward Yang explained it so well in the commentary at this particular moment, if you recall, which is that it's like a third party shouldn't interfere or shouldn't interrupt the truly intimate moment that is occurring between these two characters at that particular moment in time. So in order to express that respect, that distance he wants to give, Edward Yang chooses to shoot them from afar. But the fact that he chooses to shoot them from afar means that he allows the two characters to play out the scene in the most intimate of terms, and it's a real fight or a real explosion of frustration that we see from NJ for the first time in the film, I think. It's probably the most intimate moment of emotional expression that we ever see from NJ. And therefore, the fact that the camera is shot from a distance is a tool by which he allows the characters to be their most intimate, which I think is so wonderfully contradictory. And it just shows the power of Edward Yang cinema, and the way in which he uses not only landscape and the mise en scène, but also the three-dimensional aspect, the distance. And in fact, he suggests therefore that distance can equal intimacy, and that is so wonderfully complex in terms of visual cinema. I can't begin to tell you how excited that makes me in terms of what the implications are for this kind of storytelling and visual storytelling in cinema. The fact that we are distant and separate from the characters makes their exchange all the more intimate. Truly fascinating. So where was I? So anyway, so this is, I think, that element of, say, the urban life and urban living in the context of NJ and his character arc, at least in those terms. Another theme that's played out, I think, in the context of the characters, and it's a theme that I think we've seen Edward Yang explore in the past, is this notion of how past and present are related, or how they are maybe incongruity with each other, or maybe they are distinct and separate from each other. We've seen past and present play out in generational terms, in terms of father-son relationships. In other words, the father's story mirrors the son's story. I mean, we've seen this played out very poignantly, I think, in particular in the film Mahjong. We've also seen certain remnants of that in A Confusion, I would argue. We certainly see that in A Brighter Summer Day. So we have parallel stories that transcend generational boundaries, but also suggest a sort of temporal pattern, right? Namely, that the father's story, the older generation's story, is a story that will be mirrored by the younger generation. So the past tends to repeat itself in the present. The father's story tends to repeat itself in the son's story, and we see this in Brighter Summer Day, we see this in Mahjong, etc. And I think we see this played out in Yi, but in a very interesting way. Now, what do I mean by this? Okay. Yi has this wonderful storyline with the daughter, who is Ting Ting. And she has many aspects to a character, of course, but one of her story arcs is, of course, her relationship with her neighbor, her friend Lily, and also Lily's boyfriend or ex-boyfriend, I'm not quite sure if it's ex or not, Fatty. And then the relationship that develops between Fatty and Ting Ting. And then this culminates in their date, which is one of the most magical moments in the film. And why do I say this? Because this is the moment where, right, we see the two of them, Fatty and Ting Ting, on their date. And we see them holding hands, of course. And this is the famous intercutting between the shots of NJ and Sherry in Japan. And NJ is talking about, I remember I held your hand as we crossed the street when I was young. And this is then intercut with shots of Fatty and Ting playing out the exact same theme, the same scene that NJ is himself expressing in words about what he's describing about his own past and his past with his old girlfriend. Well, here we see it played out in real terms. In other words, we see the past and present collide within the same space on the one hand, but they are acting on different temporal planes. It's almost like the past and present are colliding, and also they're existing in parallel universe, all within the same moment. I don't know if that makes sense, but it is really fascinating the way in which time is employed, and the temporal space is almost broken and preserved. And I don't think we've seen this treatment of the generational connection and divide existing within the same moment. Because it's really wonderful, right? Because we see the moment of Fatty and Ting played out, and when we see how the storyline plays out, because their relationship, as we know, disintegrates in quite a spectacular way. We do know also that NJ's relationship with Sherry will also end in a way that I think will lead to sadness on the part of both of those characters. So there is a certain parallel structure that occurs with respect to the storyline of NJ and Sherry on the one hand, and Fatty and Ting on the other hand. So it's almost like the older generation is mirrored by the younger generation, although they are played out in slightly different ways, of course. I mean, Fatty's story plays out in a much more violent fashion than the NJ storyline. But still, I think they're similar in the sense that the relationships disintegrate. So on the one hand, the older generation story mirrors the younger generation story. But this is not played out in terms of, a past storyline is now mirrored in the present storyline. But they are played out in the same space. In other words, we see it played out within the same temporal line, but at the same time it's not, because of the way of the use of editing and intercutting. And I think that kind of complexity is really magical. It's so complex that I think the way I've described it is actually quite inappropriate, because I think there's probably a much better way of describing it. But it's the past and the present both colliding in the same moment, but then also clearly distinct from each other, all within the same moment. And I think that kind of interactivity, that kinetic interactivity that occurs within that particular moment of cross-generational storylines that are in parallel, but also at crossroads with each other, is truly remarkable. And it's something that I think we haven't quite seen in earlier Edward Yang works, although we have seen, again, similar treatments of older generations and younger generations, but not quite in this way as we've seen in E. It's really quite a miraculous way of expressing story. Gosh, and then, also what we have here is, I think, in many ways, expressions of pessimism. We see the expressions of pessimism shown perhaps in, as I say, the business dealings of NJ and his disappointment with how the business dealings work out. We see this also with almost the kind of comic pessimism that we see, the portrayal of Boss Huang and his women entourage, and the fact that he's connected with government. Perhaps that's a kind of pessimistic, satirical portrait of what Edward Yang views of government organs. We also see a kind of satirical, perhaps pessimistic view of religion, or this kind of religious getaway that Min Min, the mother, experiences, and we see the interaction between the religious leader and the spiritual leader and NJ, and the fact that the spiritual leader is essentially asking for money. A check will do nicely, of course. And so those sorts of moments, I think, point to a kind of satirical edge, a biting satirical edge that Edward Yang is portraying. And these, I think, are maybe not on the fore, but they are oblique references to religion. We did see certain religious treatments very mildly, perhaps in a Confucian, for example, A Brighter Summer Day, for example. And they are not major elements. But perhaps another element is this idea of democracy played out. And again, this is the notion of Boss Huang and his relationship with the president and his role in the legislature, and the fact that he's presented from a distance as this fat, slovenly man who just cares about women and sex or something like that. And so I think this is a kind of a running commentary that we've seen played out in the context of Edward Yang's discussion of the emerging Taiwan democracy and the implications that it has on society writ large, but also on the individual character. And while I don't necessarily see that played out quite prominently in this film EE as perhaps as strongly as it's played out in, let's say, A Brighter Summer Day or even Mahjong, I would still argue that this depiction here of the Boss Huang character in that aspect is a very satirical, biting commentary on what perhaps Edward Yang might be suggesting, which is maybe something approaching a kind of political corruption, something that is without any sort of strong spiritual meaning, and something that doesn't hold any answers, at least for NJ, because the path of Boss Huang and the copycat of Ota, which ends up becoming one of the girlfriends of Boss Huang, is ultimately the path that NJ is not in agreement with. So there is this theme of kind of a depiction of, let's say, of Taiwan democracy or Taiwan society that I think Edward Yang is at least in certain aspects anyway, painting pessimistic or satirical portraits of in the film EE. But amongst this notion of pessimism, I would say that there is a strong current of optimism. There is an overwhelming current of optimism that pervades this work, that populates this work, that lives very healthily in this work. And it's very refreshing, because I would argue that while Edward Yang's past films have not been totally devoid of optimism, we have seen flashes of optimism in the way in which characters develop. I would argue that this is perhaps the case, from a certain point of view anyway, with certain characters in That Day on the Beach. I would say that this might be the case, although I'm not quite sure, with the story Taipei Story. This probably is the case with the Confucian. But I would say that there is an overriding sense of pessimism and doubt and even darkness that also pervades the world of Edward Yang as he paints it in his films. Taipei Story, That Day on the Beach for sure, A Brighter Summer Day for sure, a Terrorizer definitely, a Mahjong definitely. But that makes this film E, I think, all the more remarkable because of the strong currents of optimism that we see painted in this film. And it's not an optimism that I think is forced on the film in an unnatural way. I think it's an optimism that is organic. It grows naturally from the situations that are strongly painted and the characters that he strongly represents. What do I mean by this? Well, for example, let's take a look at the character arc of the little boy, Yang Yang. He is, I think, in many ways, the heart and soul of this film, because he is young, he is an explorer, he is on a path of self-discovery. He is trying to ask questions that go at the very nature of existence, that go at the very nature of human understanding, that go at the very nature of, existentialism. And also, what he asks about, how do I know what you see is true? This is in many ways the heart of sort of the dilemma that is existence, right? How do I know the truth that you say that you know? How can I see what you see? How can I see what it is I can't see? And these are questions that are truly deep, I think. And he approaches it, the little boy, Yang, approaches it in a way that, he doesn't try to impose a certain truth of what he perceives to be the truth or his philosophy onto the characters around him, but he's merely asking questions. And he is shown also in the pursuit of discovery. And that pursuit of discovery is seen in many ways that I think are very endearing, very charming, but also very profound. And that profound nature of this idea of self-discovery, I think, is what lends the picture very nicely to this overall sense of optimism for the future. Because, there's something quite optimistic about the idea of discovering something new. And so what does he discover? What do we see him on the path of trying to discover? Well, we see him, for instance, trying to figure out how to make a water balloon, right? Or he tries to figure out how to make balloons, which leads to making, how do you make water balloons? That leads to his curiosity about photography. First, he's trying to photograph bugs or something, that turns into photographs of light and air and spaces, that turns into photographs of the backs of people's heads, because his philosophy is that he wants to show what it is that people cannot see. He wants to help people see what it is they cannot see on their own. My goodness, that is so profound. And this self-discovery also plays itself out with his infatuation with a young girl at school, and she is a swimmer, and that leads to his fascination and curiosity about water and swimming. And so he is on the road of exploration and discovery and experimentation when it comes to water and holding one's breath underwater and trying to go into the pool. This is an amazing moment, I should add, because this moment is the moment, recall where he is at the pool and he's by himself and he's taking off his shoes and he's about to jump into the water. And the camera is fixed from a certain distance. And we see him jump into the water. And then the clouds the sky is gray and we hear thunder. It's quite portentous, actually. And he jumps and we hear him struggle. We don't necessarily see him, but we hear him struggle. It's almost like he's drowning. And it's quite a scary moment, actually, because of the thunder and everything that goes on. And it's around this time, it's around maybe the 2/3 mark or the 3/4 mark of the film. So you would kind of expect, one's expectations would be that this is around the time that the film will hit you with a really dramatic moment. And there's nothing, I think, more dramatic than the death of a little boy. And so all the pieces seem to fit into place for a certain expectation that this boy will drown and die. And the film cuts away at a precise moment where we don't know what happens to the boy. And so I think for a lot of us, we expect the worst, at least I do. I remember when I saw this film in the theater for the first time when it was released, there was a gasp in the audience when this scene happened, because everyone, myself included, thought that the boy was drowning and he was going to die. And the film cuts away almost cruelly, leaving us suspended in this air of suspense, not knowing what happens to this little boy. And so there's a certain ominous tone that is there, and that could have led to this real strain of pessimism. But the film, remarkably, miraculously, does not take that route. Oh, no, it doesn't. On the contrary, my friends, what happens? Very nonchalantly, Yang Yang opens the door and walks into the apartment, all wet, soaked, but with a little smirk on his face, almost kind of Mona Lisa smile on his face, if you will. There's a certain pride. He's done it. He's made some kind of discovery, or he's done something, and he's proud of it. Wow. What a moment, my friends. It could have turned so dark on a dime. It could have become such a pessimistic film on a dime, but instead it becomes yet another act of beautiful self-discovery on the part of Yang Yang. My goodness, if this isn't a strong statement of optimism, my goodness, I don't know what is. The fact that it's presented in this way is suggestive of the fact that this film is showing such a strong undercurrent of optimism that is, I don't want to say refreshing necessarily, but it's certainly something that is really nice to see. Really is, because I think we are in many ways rooting for these characters, the Jian family, and we want them to find happiness at the end of their story, their journey. So it's truly wonderful. And there are certain resolutions that occur with these characters that I think are kind of beautiful. I mean, the resolution, for instance, of Ting and the grandmother, the fact that Ting feels guilty for leaving the garbage out, and perhaps that's the reason why the grandmother fell into the poor condition that she did, because she threw the trash out, which was something that Ting should have done, but she forgot. So Ting cannot sleep, or she's having trouble sleeping because of certain guilt that she feels. Well, that situation is resolved so beautifully in the moment between Ting and her grandmother, which we are meant to believe that it could have been a dream, or perhaps it could not have been a dream. That little piece of origami perhaps is an indication of one thing or another. So elliptically beautiful. But that resolution is, I think, a level of optimism that could have, that basically is included in Ting's storyline, which up to then I think is very dark, right? Because Ting's storyline up to that point dealt with the violence of Fatty and his killing of the lover, the next door neighbor, the lover of both the mother and the daughter. Such a dark ending, but it's punctuated by this beautiful poetic moment between grandmother and granddaughter that I think levels a sense of optimism, or perhaps if optimism is too strong a word for you, but perhaps a kind of maybe poetic hopefulness, if you will. And that punctuates the final act of Ting's character arc, which could have been quite dark and deadly indeed. But again, Edward Yang allows a certain kind of optimism and salvation that I think creates a nice poetic finish to Ting's character arc. And then, of course, I think there is a certain resolution that we see also with Adi's character and his wife, Xiaoyan, because Xiaoyan is, I think, seen as a kind of outsider from the very beginning. Remember, there's a scene in the car between Ting and NJ about perhaps, the grandmother thinks that Xiaoyan is someone that shouldn't be included in their inner circle or something to that effect. But we see actually in the course of the film that the relationship between Adi and Xiaoyan, the husband and wife. Adi is a bit of a bumbler. He's made a lot of financial mistakes, we assume. So he's a bit of a fool. And Xiaoyan, we expect her to be shallow, perhaps, because of the way that Ting speaks of her. But in fact, their relationship is one of the most optimistic in the film. They have certain bouts of bad luck, brought about perhaps by the hijinks of Yun and her unexpected appearances at baby showers or at weddings and the like. So there are certain bouts of bad luck that lead to comic turns, that lead to potentially tragic turns, right? Because of the attempted suicide of Adi around the middle of the film. And this is after the birth of their child, remember. But their relationship is strong. It's remarkably strong, because I think of the sort of the innocence of Adi on the one hand, but also I think the strength of character of Xiaoyan as the wife on the other. And I think their relationship is one of the most optimistically portrayed relationships in Edward Yang's filmography. It certainly is one of the great couples. I mean, they are secondary characters, I would argue, because of the relatively short amount of screen time that is devoted to them, at least relative to NJ's storyline or Tingting's storyline, I would argue, of course. But that being said, their character arc, or their relationship, is really quite beautiful. And Xiaoyan proves herself to be a very devoted wife and a really resilient and strong person. And so I really applaud their relationship, and I think their outcome is, there are still some doubts about what will happen with their future. And will this sudden rush of good luck with the antique jade that he found, will that last? Perhaps it won't, because Adi doesn't seem to have been cured of his buffoonery. But still, there is a certain sense of optimism portrayed in their relationship, is it not? Because of the way in which they are portrayed. And it is a very positive light. So there is that. And, even with, let me return to the NJ character and the Ota character, the Japanese businessman character. Of course, the end result of that business relationship wasn't anything that led to anything fruitful, unfortunately. I mean, there is no business deal in the end. But there are moments of human connection between the two of them that are really quite beautiful. Really very beautiful. And I think Mr. Ota's expression of every day is a first time is, I think, a wonderful expression of a kind of philosophy of human endeavor, and the importance of human endeavor, and also the importance of human endeavor and human connection. I think there is a certain expression of philosophy that is very positive, very optimistic, and it's very optimistic because at its heart, I think, is the importance that it places on human connection. Of course, query whether human connection is fully played out at the end. I mean, there are moments of doubt that are expressed. We see the doubt that is, I think, expressed on the faces of the family, NJ, Min, Ting, as they're sitting, at the funeral after the death of the grandmother. And there is even a certain doubt, poignant perhaps, but still doubt, that is expressed by the young boy in his final eulogy or speech to his now dead grandmother, how he feels old too, which is such a beautiful way to end the film. So, of course, it's not all, how should I put it, wine and roses. It's not all truly optimistic. It's not, everything is not happy and everyone lives happily ever after at the end. No, this is a portrayal of something that one might call human drama that is trying to be akin to real life. And as we know, real life is not always happiness and wine and roses. And we wouldn't want it to be, otherwise it would be something that would be unnatural or inorganic. But even with that self-doubt, or even with the doubt that still haunts these characters once the credits roll, there are still undercurrents of hope, optimism, and positivity that I think are undeniable in this film, which I think makes for a miraculous view, and a view that is unforgettable. Truly unforgettable. This is EE. I should say that, right, if you look closely at this film EE, you will spot Edward Yang. He is actually in the film. It's almost like a moment that is akin to Alfred Hitchcock in his his cameos. Edward Yang does make a cameo. So try to spot it, if you will. If you don't know where it is, listen to the commentary, because the commentary does reveal the precise moment where Edward Yang does appear. It isn't quite obvious, but yes, he does appear, and Edward Yang does acknowledge such in the commentary. So try to look out for that particular moment. It's really great. This is EE, and I think my comments do not do the film justice. I think the film is too rich, too detailed, too complex. It is both complex in terms of its mise-en-scène. It's also complex in terms of its depth. It's also complex in terms of its temporal complexity. It's complex not only in space, but also in time. But at the same time, and I go back to my original point, in many ways, it is still Edward Yang's most accessible work, or one of his most accessible works, which I think creates this wonderful dynamic, the foundation for a modern masterpiece that is EE. This is the final film by the master, Edward Yang. Okay, my friends, that is EE. So those are my general comments of EE. I hope maybe if you have any thoughts or comments yourself, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I would love to hear what it is you have to say. And in the meantime, my friends, I will make one more video, or at least one more video, to conclude my thoughts and comments about the filmography of Edward Yang. And so from there, yes, I hope that maybe that can be another opportunity for us to continue the discussion of the works of Edward Yang, and try to provide some what I feel to be some maybe closing remarks on the video series journey that I have been so fortunate to have made with respect to the works of Edward Yang. So there will be at least one more video coming, just as a capper, or as a closing video to this series. So please keep a lookout for that. In the meantime, my friends, again, if you have any thoughts or comments about this film or Edward Yang's filmography in general, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Other than that, please be happy and healthy and well, my friends. And until we meet again, I hope you are well, that you are taking good care of yourself and your family and friends, and that you are watching a lot of great movies. So my dear friends, thank you so much again for your time. It really means a lot. Until we meet again, cheers and zaijian.